Hi, everyone. Welcome to Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. This broadcast is brought to you by Mace Media Group and Terpenes and Testing magazine, the industry's first publication dedicated to cannabis science. I'm Jason Lupoi, and I'm the editor-in-chief of Terpenes and Testing magazine, and I'll be your host as we navigate across the landscape of cannabis and psychedelics science. I once read an article that referred to cannabis testing labs as the industry's dirty little secret. There were reports of lab shopping, which is where clients of a lab paid for specific results. And some labs were found to be dry labbing, where they weren't even running the samples for contaminants and were giving their customers a passing grade. Other labs were shut down. And these stories loomed large in the media, and rightfully so, since our third-party labs are the last line of defense before products go to consumers. But these were just a few rotten apples amongst a sizable bunch and did not portray the cannabis analytical testing industry at large. The vast majority of labs have ethically minded scientists at the helm who understand why their services are paramount for consumer safety and work hard to stay compliant to evolving regulations. So for this episode, I wanted to speak with Shannon Swantek. Shannon is the principal scientist and CEO of Enlightened Quality Analytics, LLC. She holds broad knowledge of the environmental, nutritional supplement, and cannabis industries. She has a robust background that includes 10 years of experience performing audits nationally to the ISO IEC 17025, ISO IEC 9001 in CGMP standards in environmental, food, agriculture, and cannabis laboratories. Shannon has experience as a project manager, analytical chemist, and senior scientist in environmental, drinking water, and nutritional supplement laboratories, as well as developing the cannabis consulting program at a primary environmental consulting firm. With a deep network of industry professionals, Shannon has participated in investor relations such as due diligence audits and introductions, helped processors and producers come up to CGMP and ISO 9001 compliance from facility design to production, and helped license holders nationwide work with their laboratories for high quality data that is appropriate to their products. Shannon has been supporting the cannabis industry for 6 years in regulatory, technical, and quality support roles. As a cannabis industry expert, Shannon served on the Cannabis Testing Rules Advisory Committee, which advised on the testing legislation for both the Oregon Health Authority for medical cannabis and Oregon Liquor Control Commission for adult use cannabis sampling and analysis on a wider level. She also assisted the Oregon Department of Justice, Oregon Department of Agriculture, OHA, OLCC by regularly advising on policy in all parts of the cannabis industry legislation pertaining to testing, labeling, processing, and cultivation. Shannon, welcome to the podcast.
Jason, thank you so much for having me. Terpenes and Testing has always been such a huge support for the industry. It's a pleasure to be here.
I appreciate that. And I appreciate you. You've been a advisory board for Terpenes and Testing and have been a go-to for us for, compliance related things and regulatory issues, which is definitely something that has kind of been a struggle for some folks in the industry to stay compliant with ever-changing regulations. So before we dive into that, I was just curious if we could kind of kickstart the conversation by having you share how you got involved in the cannabis industry, and did you come from another industry where you were able to apply your expertise to cannabis?
Actually, I was in Oregon, and I had followed my brother there, and my brother was actually a medical grower in Eugene when I moved to Oregon in 2006. And I worked for 2 different state agencies. I worked for the Oregon Department of Environmental Quality, and through them, I started getting involved in the auditing and assessment of drinking water and other environmental labs. And that was a cooperative program with the Oregon Health Authority. And so my brother actually passed away in 2010, but I was always really fascinated by the possibility of this medicine and how much we didn't know, but how much it was really helping his patients. And so, I did have a small community of my own after he passed away that was always giving me information about the medical regulations and kind of some of the ways that they really fell short when it came to patient safety and consistent medicine. And so when I started assessing laboratories full-time for the Oregon Health Authority and the adult use measures passed, they asked my program if we could audit and accredit the first cannabis labs. Oregon had the first lab oversight and accreditation program in the country. Colorado and Washington had lab regulations, but they didn't quite have that inspection or audit type component to them. And so for 18 months, I was the main point of contact for anyone who thought they were going to start a cannabis lab in Oregon. And because we were creating some of the first pesticide lists, some of the first solvent lists, at that point, extracts were still a couple of years new, and there was a lot to learn about the production of them. So I became involved in a lot of the different technical aspects of writing those rules and regulations. And I knew that the community at large didn't really know what was about to hit them with these new lists, especially the pesticide lists. And so I started speaking at industry meetings and trying to take as much feedback as I could to the regulators, who were also kind of, starved for information. So I tried to be that bridge as much as possible.
Yeah, I remember back to the several years ago when I first got involved in the cannabis industry, right around 2015, and we often would look to some of those guidelines from Oregon specifically. I remember speaking with Roger Volker at a conference. I can't remember if it was an Emerald conference, but he was kind of talking about some things co-extracting, like pesticides, when you're doing extractions, or a concentration of mycotoxins and extracts. And those were all very foreign things to me at the time. And it was that literature that was really eye-opening to how we needed to start approaching a lot of these types of tests.
Yeah, Roger really contributed a lot to the very first kind of like research into the analysis of these compounds beyond just the cannabinoids and into the contaminants, like these more complex pesticides. And he was kind of the first one to be able to produce enough consistent data for us to really understand how complex the matrix is, compared to any other agricultural crop, with the amount of terpenes and alkaloids and flavonoids and all the different types of compounds in cannabis. It is one of the most complex matrices I've seen. And that includes, very complex things from like environmental landfill leachates that are multi-phase. Sometimes they have less interference than our just cannabis flower does on one of those instruments. So we really appreciated Roger back then. So we appreciate him now, of course.
I'm curious how you've seen the analytical testing side of the industry change over your time in the industry, and if you've seen things get better. I mentioned in my opening that you'd see headlines about the testing being the dirty little secret of the industry, and I think those were, like I said, some rather rotten apples that didn't need to spoil the whole bunch. And I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Sure. I mean, I think you have to look at kind of two different aspects of that. As I mentioned, before, pesticide testing had really tried to align with FIFRA, which isn't to say all these pesticides on the state lists aren't toxic. It's that you can't really use toxicity as a measure because the EPA has not approved any of it. So FIFRA says you can't use anything until the EPA says so on a crop. And therefore, we had to get as low as analytically possible. So I just talked about this complex matrix. And then you work in the amount of money that is involved in sort of losing a batch due to contamination, especially if you're an extractor and you didn't choose whether or not to use that pesticide. You're looking at two things. You're looking at a market that was very, very motivated to do lab shopping and to ask labs to, give them data that was better for their bottom line. But then you also had analytical instrumentation that a lot of these labs had yet to work on that was required to get down to these low levels that no other industry is asked to get down to. So cannabis tests things like pesticides, lower than almost any other agricultural crop, and fails them lower than any other agricultural crop. And because it is this complex matrix, when you get into something like an LC triple quad, that requires a very high level of professional judgment, and you had to have worked on that type of technology for quite a while in such a complex matrix that we knew very little about extracting and whether some of these pesticides were too polar or not polar enough for the extraction methods. So some of it was bad apples. Some of it was literally just real scientists running as fast as they could and trying to develop methods on very sensitive technology. And there's only so much you can rush that process. So for a while, the data, was very shaky for a number of reasons, but now we have states with strong oversight programs, and a lot of labs have shut down simply because of the bad PR when they have been exposed to being willing to change their data for clients. And we've also seen, the client base in the industry become more aware and demand more from their laboratories and demand more from their industry. I think we're finally starting to turn around and say, hey, we can never take this up to a national level with a reputation that we're willing to kind of constantly subjugate the rules. So I think when you look at the two different areas of where we were babies before, we've matured a lot in the lab industry.
Yeah, I think so too. And I think you brought up a great point there about, labs having to kind of create methods on the fly. That's been something that I think is kind of a trademark of this industry because everything's so new. And I think the hemp industry really kind of bolstered that because once things were made federally illegal, you had CBD going into every different type of product you could think of, which creates a lot of different matrix effects. And I don't think, labs might have been necessarily ready for that kind of influx of all those different matrices when, a lot of times I would hear labs would be developing their methods on flower and then hoping to transfer those to other analytes or other sample forms and product forms. And I think that's absolutely right. Like having to figure out what you don't know on the fly while an industry is kind of soaring, I think that really led to some issues. I was curious too that you mentioned that the regulations in the cannabis industry are a lot more stringent than other industries. And you mentioned that you also had worked with, drinking water. And I was curious how the regulations differed between those two, cannabis and drinking water.
It's kind of funny that you asked that because they they both have strengths as far as protecting public safety, but very different ones. Drinking water has and environmental as an industry as a whole is probably the most regulated industry until cannabis came around, and that was as a result of the laboratories that were sort of in the same position with the first Superfund sites in the early cleanup days. So there were laboratories that were pressured, back then to find less contaminants and to change their data quite a bit. And as a result, there was a lot of federal crackdowns and people came in and seized hard drives, and lab directors went to jail, the analysts went to jail. Nobody could figure out who is responsible for some of this fraud. And as a result, environmental methods are very prescriptive now. They prescribe the QC and the control limits and generally which method you have to be on, whether you're a wastewater or drinking water lab. And the methods themselves have very tight quality control objectives. In cannabis, the rules are being developed. Let's see, how do I put this? In environmental, the lists are based on what these environmental permits or these drinking water contaminant lists contain. And the lists that we developed in cannabis are not based in the same decades of research about their risk to public health. They were, the best stopgap measure we had until we were actually allowed to do some research and some testing of the industry's product, because before, only the medical product got tested and only for what was requested. And so the hope was, as we got more and more data about what is actually a risk on cannabis, and you see this happening, after Oregon made their lists, a lot of states decided to add microbiology and heavy metals because we finally understood that those were also risks. At the same time, a lot of these pesticides, while forbidden, are not really being found, and some of these solvents might not be so toxic at very low levels. And so um, the weakness in drinking water, even though it's so strongly controlled and regulated, is that it's very stagnant in how we update new risks to public health and how we add things like PFAS to a drinking water contaminant list, so that everybody's drinking water was free of these contaminants we now know are very dangerous to public health. What we're hoping to see in cannabis is that not only is the testing, excuse me, not only is the testing, getting so much more accurate, but it's the hope that we are actually going to move towards regulatory structures that can accommodate all these different matrices. We're not just drinking water, and the producers of each matrix, of each type of product, should probably be the ones that understand the testing that their product needs the most to control their own risk. So right now, the way that cannabis is developing, we hope it doesn't become drinking water where it takes forever for a new product to sort of have its risks be known. We would hope that the responsibility of understanding the risks of each product, just like in food and pharmaceuticals and nutritional supplements, get put back on the producer, where the producer orders their own tests for their own risks. And that's what I'm hoping to see, because the real weakness in drinking water is the fact that it's not moving along with what we know about public health and safety. But in cannabis, we have that ability to kind of get flexible and change that, even though we had to start off with something.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an interesting point, because that's one of the things that I've found alluring about the industry, is that everything is so new that things I guess I would say are more pliable, and as states have realized where they might be lacking, they've started to add things in. I remember when I first was in Colorado, from everything that I've been told, none of the medical cannabis that people were purchasing was actually tested, and it was only the adult use market that was getting tested. And that seemed a bit backwards to me. And of course now everything's getting tested, and I think that's one of the things that I found to be the most stimulating about the industry, is that we can help evolve this industry in real time. It can be very challenging and frustrating, and there are of course concerns over consumer safety when you're evolving something real time before you've kind of fleshed out everything that you need to be doing. But I think that for me, that's part of the exciting part of the industry too. And you were talking earlier about helping Oregon get their regulations down, and then other states kind of piggybacking off of that, and that kind of leadership in the industry, I think, has been important.
Yeah, I mean, we did our best at the time, although, looking back, there are always lessons learned. And I'm really looking forward to some of the new states that are setting up programs. I think New York is starting to accept some outside labs, and it's an exciting time, and there are some very high quality players really leading the way now, and there are some organizations finally putting together some consistent standards. So I think we're going to see still more correction in the industry as labs figure out how much you have to invest in quality and compliance, in order to really thrive, and how investing in quality and compliance is part of investing in your bottom line. It's not a liability to your bottom line the way most people see it. But we also are watching processors and producers realize that at the same time. So it's really exciting to watch them all work together as they realize that all eyes are on us. So it's kind of time.
Yeah, I'm curious where you still see labs struggling to stay compliant, and what advice you would offer to help them rectify this.
Um, I do see laboratories, and I see this in every industry, kind of across the board, is that no one does really appreciate how much you need to invest in personnel resources in order to have a culture of compliance, and how much you need your entire staff to be involved in that quality culture, to understand what the background, the quality management system is, to have that data integrity training, to like really know what their role is, and not only producing accurate data, but data of known quality. And so there are times where, some of our quality control indicators might point to data bias, but we don't know how that data is necessarily being used. So it's not that that data is, um, you know, needs to be thrown out. It needs to be qualified in such a way that everybody like knows what that data is good for. So there's still a lot of room for growth in terms of like, um, hiring enough quality personnel to really do the job. And in a cannabis lab in one of the states that requires all the testing, in my opinion, that's more than one person. It's at least, it's at least one position, plus another dedicated half at the very least. But it's also having every single staff member, from the samplers all the way up to top management, understanding exactly, how they produce data, how they meet their clients' needs, and how they know what the quality of the data is that they're putting on their reports.
Yeah, that's a really powerful point there, and understanding how one creates data and how to use that data. Some folks have said they see places collecting a bunch of data, but it's not really useful data, and the data that might serve to be the most useful for them in their process, they're not paying attention to. So, in a world where data is definitely king, it's interesting that sometimes we have so much of it, we're not really sure what to do with it, and how to make sense of it, and are we collecting the right data.
And people in the top tiers of other industries know that data can be as valuable as gold. And you're right, crap data in and crap data out. But what we're not using this data for yet, or what I don't see consistently, is people using this data to, they're happy when they pass contaminant testing, and they're happy if they got their cannabinoid and terpenoid numbers where they formulated to be. But we could be really controlling our products. We could be putting out, a very consistently formulated product every single batch by using the data we're already being regulated to produce. So I'd love to kind of see people learn how to use their reports for improving, their production, for improving their output, for reducing their risk of inconsistent product. And that really gets us a lot closer to people being able to use controlled products in things like clinical trials.
What could you comment on what resources you could point to for a struggling lab to consult to help them get back, towards regulatory compliance?
I do think that laboratories underutilize in a lot of cases their ISO accrediting bodies and their state regulatory agencies. I think it's really important in the state regulatory agencies. Even when I was on the other side, we're all just people, and everyone was learning at the same time. So if you can like reach out and understand exactly where you're falling short, and have that good relationship with your regulators where you can ask them questions, or you can show them something and ask them if it's meeting their expectations, that's really important. But it really will depend on where the lab is struggling in their compliance. Sometimes that's why you need to step back and use the ISO system, where you are performing root cause analysis on your nonconformances to your own system. And so when you know what your nonconformances are, it may be that you don't have enough staff resources. It may be that you need new equipment because your equipment is just too unstable to get you where you need to be as far as meeting the method quality objectives. Your root cause analysis could point to undue pressure as it pertains to how much sample throughput you're trying to get out of somebody in an 8-hour day. So regulatory compliance is this ongoing everyday culture and mindset. And it all comes down to how you handle those small deviations, how you do your root cause analysis, and how you fix them so that they don't recur.
Yeah, I used to do some auditing for one of the state's cannabis markets, third-party lab auditing. And that was one of the things that I found to be key in my role as an auditor, is helping the labs get to doing better science or helping them maintain compliance, and not kind of being this, I don't. I wanted to make sure it was a two-way street, that I was available for them if they had questions, and I would try to help them get to where they needed to be, as opposed to just giving a deficiency or whatever. I wanted to try to help them get to a better place, because, as I said at the outset, the work that they're doing is quite important for consumer safety, and obviously I know a lot of people who are consumers, and it all kind of ties together there. So if they can do better science, then everybody wins there, and so I think that's important for people to have relationships, like you said, with their auditing bodies or their state regulatory programs, or, like you said, their ISO certifying groups too. Use them to your advantage and ask them questions. And I think that what I've noticed, whether it be GMP or organic or things like that, usually those agencies are very willing to help.
And you have like different support coming from each. So with your ISO accrediting bodies, they can't cross this line into consulting because it creates a conflict of interest. But the states generally do have that component you spoke of, and that we had in Oregon, where we could provide a certain amount of technical guidance as long as we provided it to everyone. I think the component that we didn't speak about yet is really getting involved in these industry groups that are standardizing the methods and are trying to bring all the laboratories or all the producers together, to talk about what we have learned from the data so far, and put together rules and oversight regulations that make sense now that we know more. And so, the state regulators do still have their obligation to kind of be this oversight, even though a lot of them are just like you and I, in terms of they just want to help as much as possible. There's also an education component there. And so that's where this third part of the industry groups, such as ASTM and AOAC, the groups that are working in those various efforts to create these standards, are really a very important third piece to educating both the labs and the regulators. I think all three of those kind of relationships are just so key.
Yeah, and it's exciting to see that those entities have been going strong at creating standards and literature for the cannabis industry. Those ASTM and AOAC being very credible agencies that have saw the need to kind of step up and create those types of documents for the industry. So definitely excited to see that. We have a few minutes here. I just wanted to talk about your time working with an agency such as the Oregon Department of Justice. From my own experience, often folks working in a regulatory capacity in a given state are not necessarily cannabis experts, and they need someone like yourself to help them better understand how to evolve their regulations. And I was curious, in how did you work with the Oregon Department of Justice, for example, and how receptive have you found them and other agencies at the state level to be?
That's an interesting question, because at the time, this was back in 2015, and there was actually multiple agencies, because the Oregon Liquor and Control held the authority over most of the adult use regulations and licensing, and the Oregon Health Authority was to retain, and now, just like other states, these have combined. But back in the day, the Oregon Health Authority retained their authority over the medical licenses. And so DOJ was just trying to get all these written underneath certain mandates, such as EPA's FIFRA, and really meet the mandate of the overarching proposition. And then you had everybody from the industry groups that had certain interests. So I was really lucky to kind of come from that background, where I did know growers and extractors, and they were very medicine minded. They were all about creating clean and organic and safe products. And so I had this great sort of community behind me that was able to provide me with a lot of information of what was happening, and like what the feedback was, and how these new regulations, how hard they were going to hit, or even how rational they were. I mean, there was a time where they were trying to regulate alcohols and tinctures, and that kind of defeats the purpose and the efficacy of the medicine. But in my experience, I also worked with the Massachusetts Department of Public Health, and helped them draft some of their sub-regulatory guidance for the laboratories. And I think in my experience with both those states and with some other states where I've been, kind of present for the rulemaking process, there are people that are just so committed to getting it as right as they can. And I think that's the majority of the people. And then there are a lot of people that, maybe have so much risk in their position or their role. It's hard for them to kind of to look at the industry needs from both sides as I was able to. So I didn't find it to be a closed-minded community. I just found that there were so many interests at play that sometimes public health and safety and a state's control of their own risk didn't always come out sounding like the same thing. But I think that is also something that the new states are learning and doing a better job of.
Yeah, I think that what we've seen is so many different states coming on board with different angles to their protocols and some crossover. It's kind of like we've had this community where there's a bunch of different experiments going on, and hopefully we figure out what works and what doesn't work quickly, and we adopt what works and discard what doesn't.
And all we can hope for is that when they take this to the federal level, that the federal regulators, they will have data. And that was something that we as states didn't really have. And so it's a matter of getting the labs all producing, standardized data of like known qualities so we can finally use it our decision making. That's going to be so exciting.
Yeah, I look forward to it. Shannon, it was great to talk with you today. I thank you for being our guest today and for, being a Terpenes and Testing Advisory Board member for quite some time. You've always been a nice go-to source for us for questions regarding compliance and regulatory endeavors. And, this might not be the most glamorous thing to be talking about in the industry, but it's definitely something that is validating and legitimizing to an industry that a lot of people didn't take seriously. So I thank you for all the work that you've done.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. You always have such great insight in these topics, Jason. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks everyone for tuning in. We will see you next time on Terpenes and Testing, the podcast. Until then, please come visit us at www.terpenesandtesting.com or on one of our social media platforms. Cheers.